Hello, this is France 24. We are live in London with special coverage of the UK's departure from the European Union. 47 years, 31 days and 23 hours. That's how long the United Kingdom has been a member of what is now the world's biggest trading bloc. The EU is today saying goodbye to 15% of its economy, its biggest military spender, and the world's international financial capital, the City of London. Well, it is just coming up to 10 p.m. here in London, 11 p.m. in Paris and Brussels. I'm Catherine Nicholson, France 24's Europe editor, and I will be with you for the next 2 hours of live coverage of this very historic moment. Well, there is now just about 1 hour left before the UK officially leaves the EU. We're beginning our countdown right here, overlooking Westminster. Joining us to mark this historic moment and to help us explain what it means for the UK, for Europe and for other parts of the world too, we've got our team of reporters and correspondents dispatched around the country and around the continent. With us from central London, Clovis Casali; in Edinburgh, Catherine Norris-Trent. Chris Moore is in Belfast and Dave Keating is reporting for us from Brussels. Well, we also have a fantastic lineup of very special guests here in the studio across the next 2 hours. We'll be welcoming campaigners, professors, lords, members of the British and European Parliament, all giving us their take on how Brexit will impact ordinary citizens, businesses, the economy, even the relationship between the regions and nations of this perhaps divided kingdom. Our first guest is with us, Irina von Wiese, Liberal Democrat MEP, for the next hour at least. Thank you very much for being our guest.
Bonsoir, good evening.
Hello.
Good to be here.
Well, we'll come back to you in just a second for your thoughts about Brexit. First, though, we're going to take our viewers straight to our London correspondent, Bénédicte Paviot, who, along with us, is waiting for the Prime Minister's speech, which is going to be it's pre-recorded. It will be streamed out for us at around 10 p.m. UK time. So let's go to Bénédicte Paviot, who's been reporting all day for us. Bénédicte, Brexit really has been the most divisive issue of recent times for this country. Just tell us a bit more about how the British government has decided to mark this last hour of its EU membership.
Well, in a few minutes, we will have this address to the nation of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I think that there will not be at all a triumphalist tone at all. In fact, Sajid Javid, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has made that also very clear. He said not an ounce of energy will be wasted on that. So I think it will be a sober speech. There is a party, I'm told, in Downing Street. There will be no champagne, since champagne only comes from France. It will be English sparkling wine, and it will be the end of a chapter and the beginning of another. Concretely, legally, constitutionally, politically, it will be hugely important, but because there will be this transition period after the cut-off time tonight, midnight continental European time, nothing concretely will change for people here in Britain, or indeed EU citizens and the free movement of EU citizens. About 100 metres away from me, there is an absolutely huge roars coming and all kinds of God Save the Queen and Brexiteers who are celebrating. But there will be people across the land, we think, according to polls, who are not actually going to mark this in any way. Some people who are marking it are also very sad. They are Remainers. But this is the day that many feared would never come, or some feared would come. It is here. We are Friday, the 31st of January. I've been covering it not just from dawn till dusk today, but actually all the way since David Cameron promised that referendum, and unexpectedly it was Brexit that won it, and the rest is history. So we'll see divorce tonight, and then 31st of December 2020, that will be our next countdown for the transition, and the government hopes a future trade deal with the EU.
Thanks so much, Bénédicte Paviot. Just before we hear that speech from Boris Johnson, which is due any minute now, let's have a quick word from Catherine Norris-Trent, who's in Edinburgh. Catherine, tell us what the atmosphere is like up in Remain voting-dominated Scotland.
Well, the square outside the Scottish Parliament here in Edinburgh is filling up now. Several hundred people have come down here to mark the moment when Britain leaves the EU, and it's definitely not a celebration here, although the music has started playing. They've got the sound system out, there are bagpipe players doing the rounds, a lot of people trying to jolly along, but we've seen tears, we've seen anger, frustration, deep disappointment. A lot of people here really gutted, they're telling us, to be dragged out of the EU against their will, and there's an awful lot of frustration. But there's also a sense, people shouting freedom, people telling us they don't feel British, they feel Scottish and European. So this anger, this grief really, one woman described it as, about leaving Europe is being used to breathe new life into the push for Scottish independence, of course, for another independence referendum.
And Catherine Norris said Nicola Sturgeon made a very powerful speech earlier on, didn't she? She's definitely going full guns ahead for independence, the Scottish First Minister.
Yeah, she is indeed. It was a really interesting speech because, as usual with her, she's known, renowned as a powerful public speaker. So she's trying to keep the flame for independence burning, trying to keep up the pressure on Boris Johnson and the UK government down in Westminster. But actually, if you look at the detail of her speech, she said she hoped there could be an independence referendum in 2020, but that may not be possible. And she called on her supporters, the Scottish National Party supporters, to be patient, saying there were no shortcuts to independence. So admitting that they face huge legal obstacles. She said she wanted to do this by the book and not have any kind of Catalan scenario.
From Downing Street of Boris Johnson. I'm so sorry to cut in.
I understand all those things. Our job as a government, my job, the most important thing to say is that this is the moment when the dawn breaks and the curtain goes up on a new act in our great national drama. And yes, it's partly about using these new powers, this recaptured sovereignty, to deliver the changes people voted for, whether that is by controlling immigration or creating free ports or liberating our fishing industry or doing free trade deals or simply making our laws. Tonight, we are leaving the European Union. For many people, this is an astonishing moment of hope, a moment they thought would never come. And there are many, of course, who feel a sense of anxiety and loss. And then there's a third group, perhaps the biggest, who had started to worry that the whole political wrangle would never come to an end. I understand all those feelings, and our job as the government, my job, is to bring this country together now and take us forward. The most important thing to say tonight is that this is not an end, but a beginning. This is the moment when the dawn breaks and the curtain goes up on a new act in our great national drama. And yes, it's partly about using these new powers, this recaptured sovereignty, to deliver the changes people voted for, whether that is by controlling immigration or creating free ports or liberating our fishing industry or doing free trade deals or simply making our laws and rules for the benefit of the people of this country. And of course, I think that is the right and healthy and democratic thing to do, because for all its strengths and for all its admirable qualities, the EU has evolved over 50 years in a direction that no longer suits this country. And that is a judgment that you, the people, have now confirmed at the polls not once but twice. And yet, this moment is far bigger than that. It's not just about some legal extrication. It is potentially a moment of real national renewal and change. This is the dawn of a new era in which we no longer accept that your life chances, your family's life chances, should depend on which part of the country you grow up in. This is the moment when we really begin to unite and level up, defeating crime, transforming our NHS, and with better education, with superb technology, and with the biggest revival of our infrastructure since the Victorians, we will spread hope and opportunity to every part of the UK. And if we can get this right, I believe that with every month that goes by, we will grow in confidence not just at home but abroad. And in our diplomacy, our fight against climate change, our campaigns for human rights, female education, we will rediscover muscles that we have not used for decades. The power of independent thought and action. Not because we want to detract from anything done by our EU friends. Of course not. We want this to be the beginning of a new era of friendly cooperation between the EU and an energetic Britain, a Britain that is simultaneously a great European power and truly global in our range and ambitions. And when I look at this country's incredible assets, our scientists, our engineers, our world-leading universities, our armed forces, when I look at the potential of this country waiting to be unleashed, I know that we can turn this opportunity into a stunning success. And whatever the bumps in the road ahead, I know that we will succeed. We have obeyed the will of the people. We've taken back the tools of self-government. Now is the time to use those tools to unleash the full potential of this brilliant country and to make better the lives of everyone in every corner of our United Kingdom.
Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister there, delivering a speech recorded earlier in the day and just released there across the nation at 10 p.m. GMT here in London, 11 p.m. in Paris and in Brussels. There is, of course, just 1 hour left of the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union. Listening into that speech with me here in the studio, our very first guests of the evening. I have with me Irina von Wiese, who's a Liberal Democrat MEP for the next hour. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we also have next to you Sheila Lawler, who is a Brexit-supporting historian. You're director of Politeia
That's
as well,
right,
which
Politeia,
is a
yes.
centre-right think tank.
That's right, yes.
So just to come to you first, listening into Boris Johnson there, he was talking about a new dawn breaking for the United Kingdom. Your thoughts about that?
I think that's very true. It's a very big opportunity for Britain. It's always been a country which puts liberty, prizes liberty. People have always prized liberty and sovereignty. And they matter in themselves because of the freedom they give people to forge their own destiny and to shape the laws under which they're governed. And so, yes, it's a new freedom because they will be in the driving seat, holding the UK government to account on the pledges it has made, and I think that's wonderful.
Holding the UK government to account. So would you admit that the European Union has been used as a bit of a scapegoat?
No. I think we couldn't hold the European Union to account. The European Union makes the laws under its own procedures, and there is no way to remove politicians who make laws that don't suit this country. And also the European Union has a different model economically to Britain. It's a centrally planned model. It's an economic model which has worked very well for France, but it doesn't work for Britain.
Irina von Wiese, MEP, as I said, so somebody who's been very much within those corridors of power that we were talking about there with Sheila Lawler. What do you think of what Boris Johnson said?
Well, I think it shows how deeply divided this country really is. And to me, that is a cause of great sadness. And today is a very sad day for me and for many, many of my compatriots. For many Britons, today is a day of mourning. We have seen celebrations in Parliament Square. Many more people have indeed put a candle out tonight. They are very worried about the future of this country. I have the great honour to be serving for another hour the greatest peace project in post-war history. And I was very proud to serve my country in the European Union, and I will certainly try to pave the way for us eventually rejoining.
Well, picking up on something that Boris Johnson said and that Sheila Lawler mentioned about the making of laws and laws that the United Kingdom took on that were created at a European level, that is something that a great many people in the United Kingdom really feel resentment about.
Well, I mean, actually, the European Union has a directly elected parliament of which I was part. And it's actually the only parliament that has real power because there is no government in the European Union. There is the Council, which is an intergovernmental body, but there is no one government. So we don't rubber stamp laws. We actually have a say in them. We are able to make amendments to propose things. So in many ways, democracy really functions at its best at the European Union. And we are directly elected. The British people have elected us. And, now we're losing that say. Of course, we will still have to follow as a country the laws of the European Union. And that is also beyond 2020, because otherwise there is no trading. But we don't have a say in them anymore. I think that is a very sad position to be in.
We're just speaking about that issue of laws and rules, because it is something that we hear so much about, isn't it, Sheila Lawler? Which ones specifically? What is there particularly about EU laws that you think is so
let's
controversial?
start. I mean, you could start at the beginning. You could start that the right of people to determine how they are governed and by whom. The people of Britain never, ever voted for a political or economic union with the European Union.
There was a referendum in 1975 that confirmed the membership.
When it was a matter of the European Economic Community, which was a trading community. Now, I perfectly understand why France and Germany, after 3 horrific invasions by Germany of France in 1870, 1914 and 1940 again, it was essential to have peace and to lock in Germany into an economic project under French cooperation. But that is inimical to how Britain makes its laws. They debate them. I'll give you one example.
But not all EU laws applied in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom still made very many of its own rules.
Well, on the matters of the economy and the economic model, which, as a matter of fact, I disagree with the MEP here, but I think you do a fine job representing your MEP work. But the long and short of it is that the laws of this country are made by people who understand the needs, for instance, of our economy. And the fact that we are a free market, competitive economy. The EU is a centrally planned, directed and protected economy, and they are completely different models. We are under British law, which allows everything unless it's prohibited by law, whereas the continental model simply says you can't do anything unless it's in this big stash of regulations, many of which are made by officials in the European Union and not by any government of the day.
Well, of course, the UK has had representation at the European Parliament, but
they
take the point that you were saying.
The Commission makes and decides the law.
Well, not at all, actually. It is the Parliament that ultimately decides about law, which is directly elected. And
that's obviously
a lot of
lawyers
nuance.
Would agree with you.
They definitely would.
There's obviously a lot of nuance in all of this. We don't quite have the time in our programme to go into all of the nuance. But what I can do is to give our viewers a bit of a reminder of how we got here in the Brexit story. It began back before Brexit was even a word, in fact, with an election campaign promise from the Prime Minister before last, David Cameron. And Mathilde Benezet takes us back to where it all began.
23rd of June 2016. The Leave camp wins a narrow victory with 51.9%, sealing the UK's fate to leave the European Union. Prime Minister David Cameron, who campaigned to remain in the EU, resigns. His successor is Theresa May, a vocal opponent of Brexit. Before the vote, she would spend 3 arduous years striving to enact it. On the 29th of March 2017, the Prime Minister plunges Britain into the unknown. May triggers Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, setting the clock ticking towards an impending divorce 2 years later.
Mr. Speaker, this is an historic moment from which there can be no turning back.
But things would soon turn sour for Theresa May. In June 2017, she calls a general election, hoping to strengthen her majority in Parliament, but ending up with the opposite result. Without her absolute majority, May now has to rely on the votes of Northern Ireland's DUP. While negotiations get underway between London and Brussels, proponents of a hard Brexit oppose May's plans. In July 2018, Boris Johnson resigns from government. With May's Brexit deal finally on the table in November, more resignations follow. The sticking point is the backstop, the open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland that many of May's Conservative colleagues want to get rid of. Westminster is stuck in deadlock. Early 2019 sees the British Parliament vote 3 times against the withdrawal bill, a slap in the face for Theresa May and her government. Days away from leaving the EU without a deal, the Prime Minister asks the EU for an extension. The EU agrees. The UK's departure is now pushed back to October 31st. But for Theresa May, it's too late. The Conservative Party suffers a humiliating defeat in the European elections in May. It's the single-issue Brexit party that wins most votes, led by the kingpin of its hard Brexit agenda, Nigel Farage. The Conservative Party chooses Boris Johnson to take the keys of number 10 Downing Street. He makes a bullish start. He refuses to hold a general election, and his attempt to suspend Parliament is declared illegal by the UK's Supreme Court. In October, the UK and EU shake hands on an amended deal. But British MPs then forced Johnson to request another Brexit extension, pushing the deadline back to 31st of January 2020. So Johnson plays his trump card and calls an election, which he wins, assuring him a parliamentary majority so his deal can pass into law. The European Parliament approves his Brexit deal just a few days later. Now the UK is entering an 11-month transition phase, a chance to define the future relationship. It's a short timetable, but could be extended by 1 or 2 years.
Well, you are watching France 24's Brexit Night special with me, Catherine Nicholson, in London, as well as our reporting teams who are all around the UK and in Brussels. We're going to be with you live for the historic moment when the UK officially leaves the European Union. That's 11 p.m. London time, midnight in Brussels and Paris. It is just about 10:15 here in London right now. Now, still with me in the studio are Irina von Wiese, a Liberal Democrat MEP, and Sheila Lawler, a historian, director of Politea, a centre-right British think tank, and a Brexit supporter. We were speaking earlier about reasons why various people, including yourself, Sheila, were keen to leave the European Union. But you also mentioned, Irina, that you are already looking at trying to get the UK to rejoin the European Union. I'm sure many people would say, look, we had a referendum 3.5 years ago where a majority said they wanted to leave. How could that be a democratic idea?
Well, I think it would be naive to think that we can simply now campaign to rejoin. This is a long way that we need to pave the way for. But I do believe that opinions have changed. We know from all opinion polls in the last 18 months or so that today a majority of Britons would like to remain, would like to rejoin.
But in the general election in December, we had Boris Johnson campaigning on a Get Brexit Done platform, and he got a big majority in the British Parliament.
Well, actually, a majority of people, almost 53%, voted for parties that wanted another referendum. They wouldn't want another referendum if they were happy with the result of the first. Yeah. And they didn't get a chance only because of our electoral system, which is deeply unfair. A majority of the people who wanted now to remain did not result in a majority in the House of Commons. And that is why I believe this is a deeply unfair and sad day. Of course, I respect a real majority, but we also mustn't forget that there was a lot of disinformation, a lot of lies, which is why so many people have come to me and told me that they have changed their minds. And it is for them that I think we need to continue to fight for a close relationship with the EU. And eventually, of course, there will be no other future for Britain than to rejoin.
Well, somebody who agrees with you, we will come to you for your response in a second, Sheila Lawler. Someone who agrees with you, Irina von Wiese, is Emmanuel Macron, when you're talking about lies in the referendum campaign. President Macron giving a somewhat emotional speech just earlier on today. Take a listen as he looked back on that British campaign in 2016.
Je ne veux pas revenir ce soir sur les raisons.
Tonight, I don't want to look back at the reasons why the vote was held. It's not my place or my role. But I remember the extent to which the 2016 campaign was made up of lies, over-exaggeration, simplification, and promises that can't be kept. We must always remember how lies can affect our democracy.
De ce à quoi le mensonge peut conduire dans nos démocraties.
Here we go.
Where is the camera?
There we go. President Macron earlier on, he says that the British public were lied to. Irina von Wiese, you believe that as well. Sheila Lawler, it's been proved, hasn't it, that Boris Johnson and other leading figures of the Leave campaign in 2016 did tell untruths.
you know, this
350 million a week that will go to the NHS.
Well,
on the side
when
of a bus.
you take back the entire sum, and I have discussed this with leading UK and international economists, if you do the sums and you look at how the accounting is done, if you do not make that subvention to the EU, the money will be available to spend on British causes.
Well, now, what about other lies? Boris Johnson also said that the EU was about to let Turkey join the European Union and let Turkish people come into the UK. That's really not on the cards. Well, that is a lie.
I don't recall the circumstances, I don't recall the caveats, but I do recall the campaign of misinformation by the Remainers, and they continued not only during the Reformation, but since it. And may I just say that the disinformation by the Remain lobby on the Treasury figures, on the trade figures, on the economic...
I just want to know what disinformation, if you tell us specifically.
For instance, the trading model they used economically didn't add up. Huge sums of taxpayers' money, public money, was spent on a campaign which didn't show economic data which took account of the changes in trade after the Brexit took place.
Is this whataboutery, though?
May I just go back to some of the other points of your other guest? I do think it's important that the Liberal Democrats, people from your party, accept that they lost the referendum. They lost it fair and square. They campaigned through the back door in Parliament in order to get back and to stop Brexit happening. You saw on the 12th of December an overwhelming majority across this country, and we use the straight vote, vote X in the vote. An MP is elected for the whole constituency.
The first past the post system.
The first past the post system. It is transparent, it is fair, it doesn't lead to the horse trading and backdoor deals that happen in the European Union between parties and groups, which happen everywhere. Here we have open, transparent government, and if voters don't like what they see, they throw them out, and if they want something, they know what they'll get. And they voted for Boris Johnson, and the Conservatives won Labour support right across the country because they wanted Brexit honoured.
Well, quick question for both of you in terms of voters knowing what they were voting for. I'd like to ask both of you, did voters in June 2016 know what they were voting for in terms of exactly how Brexit is going to play out?
No, because nobody would know what Brexit actually will entail, and people still don't know. We've seen after 3.5 years that it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen. We still have the uncertainty. We still have the risk that we will fall off the cliff on the 31st of December 2020.
Why do you think that's nonsense?
This is complete nonsense. Voters will...
Well, the deal is not set out yet, if I can...
Voters
the
were,
future relationship.
Voters were voting to leave the European Union, to leave the single market, and to leave the customs union. And Parliament...
Was that written on the ballot paper, Sheila Lawler? If we're honest with ourselves.
We were voting to take back control of our laws. That means what it says. If you stay in the customs union, if you stay in the single market, you do not have control of your laws because you are under EU law, economic law,
well, let's
and
have
the
a look
ECJ.
at what is exactly the deal that Boris Johnson... I need to move on, unfortunately, because we are limited on time.
It's a complete fabrication of the Remain side to say that they didn't know what they were voting for. It was in the manifesto again in December the 12th, and they came out in their millions to vote for it. And you are deluded
I don't want to cut you off,
Sheila
Lawler, but we are limited on time, unfortunately. I understand your point. You believe people did know what they were voting for.
And 12th of December
and you very
proved
much
it
believe
again.
They didn't. OK. I think that's probably an argument that will go on until the end of time. Let's take a look at exactly what is in the withdrawal agreement, the first part of Brexit, that has been agreed and is coming into action in about 30 minutes' time. A bit more detail for you in this report that our team has prepared. Exactly how the United Kingdom is going to part company after this 47-year relationship. It's been a rather drawn-out divorce. Here's a few explanations for you from Mathilde Benezet, Julien Cheida and Yana Lee.
After a fraught 3.5 years of negotiations, the Brexit deal is coming into force. With over 100 pages, it's a complex text and it's not always written in plain English. Here are the 4 main points of the withdrawal agreement bill. As soon as Brexit takes place, a transition period will begin. During this time, the UK will still be a part of the EU's single market and continue to abide by the bloc's rules and regulations. This includes any new rules that Brussels puts into place. However, the UK will no longer have a say in any of the decision-making in Brussels. The transition period can be extended for up to 2 years. When it comes to an end, the divorce will be official. A clean break also means paying up. The deal sets out how the UK will make the divorce payment requested by the EU over London's outstanding commitments to the EU budget. It's estimated to be around €40 billion. With regards to citizens' rights, the 3.5 million Europeans who live in the UK and the 1.3 million Brits who live in the EU will be allowed to stay in their current countries of residence. Lastly, both sides have agreed on how to deal with the UK-Irish border issue. Northern Ireland will be a part of the British Customs Union, but European rules will apply at its ports. When it comes to third-party countries, it gets a little trickier. Customs checks will take place in between the island of Ireland and Great Britain. If a product enters Northern Ireland and is destined to stay there, then British customs rules apply. If the product is destined to cross the border and enter the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU, then EU rules would apply.
So we go a look at exactly what is in the withdrawal agreement. Of course, probably the much trickier part comes next. As of tomorrow, the UK is going to be in its transition period, with Boris Johnson and his government negotiating the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. We heard in his speech just before that he was talking about a new dawn breaking, national renewal, the UK creating its own laws that are for the benefit of the country. What does that precisely mean, however, I think is yet to be discovered. Irina von Wiese, what deal do you want to see Boris Johnson striking with the European Union?
Well, of course, in the interest of Britain and the European Union, it's the closest possible alignment. Boris Johnson is deluded, of course, if he thinks that he can come to a comprehensive trade agreement within 8 months. That is effectively how much time he has. Once the final agreement is on the table, it will need to be ratified. So it's about 8 months. The comprehensive trade deal with Canada, for example, has taken 10 years. So unless we have another extension of the transition period at the end of this year, I'm afraid we'll see ourselves in the same situation as we already have in October last year, which is a period of great uncertainty and eventually no deal at all, which would be catastrophic for Britain and bad for the rest of Europe as well.
Sheila Lawler, what kind of deal do you want to see Boris Johnson striking? And do you agree that a deal is possible within the transition period? Michel Barnier, for example, doesn't think that a full deal is.
No, but remember, we're in a very political phase now of the discussion. This is a matter of politics. It's not a matter of anything else. Politically, it's very important for both sides to set out on the table what the red lines are and also what the timetable. And of course it's in the EU's interest to suggest and sabre-rattle. It's been sabre-rattling. It was against Brexit from the start. I'm not surprised that the European parliamentarians and everybody else is against Brexit. And anything which rocks the boat is not to their liking, and they want to make things difficult.
Would it bother you if the United Kingdom dropped the close alignment on regulations? Just to explain that to our viewers who don't follow these things closely, this is talking about currently to enable frictionless trade. The UK and the EU have very similar standards and regulations.
Certainly. What Boris Johnson explained to Mr Tusk in August last was that when the UK left the European Union, it would maintain world-class standards in workers' protections, the labour market, in the environment, and, of course, in goods, in products.
And that's what you expect to come out of this deal?
Yes, but you do not need to have EU laws to have world-class outcomes. And under international law, just to pick up on something, if we, under international law and WTO regulations, member states cannot erect barriers against trade with other member states if the outcomes are the same. And as our outcomes will not only be the same on the 1st of January next year, but identical, it is fatuous to suggest that there cannot be frictionless trade.
Well, the UK government did say in the last couple of days that it expects, this was Downing
Yes.
Street, said that it expects that there will be some extra procedures.
There will be
perhaps
extra
alluding to
procedures. One would
customs checks on
expect
borders.
it. There will be extra procedures. There will be, and
That
a
adds
great
cost for businesses.
Well, with all due respect, if you look at how these procedures operate now, many operate and are encouraged by international law, technology, and the filling up of forms and getting them cleared technologically. And there will be one more box to tick in many cases. And at the moment, we import and export a lot to third non-EU countries, and there aren't the hold-ups.
OK, unfortunately, we will have to leave it there with both of you. Thank you both so much for giving us your
very
different points of view.
Yes.
I think we can say, but thank you for keeping it civilised. Irina von Wiese and Sheila Lawler for talking to us here as we count down to Brexit here in the United Kingdom. Well,
Thank you for having us.
Thank you both. Just to give a reminder then to our viewers, it is 10:30 p.m. here in London. It's 11:30 in Paris and in Brussels. There are 30 minutes now until the UK leaves the European Union. You're watching France 24's special live coverage with me, Catherine Nicholson, here with you until midnight London time. Now, I think we can show you now the scene out in central London. We've got a live picture for you from Parliament Square. There have been rather large gatherings there, building up throughout the afternoon and into the evening. The Brexit Party leader, Nigel Farage, leading a Brexit celebration, as you can see there on your screen, people waving the British Union flag, and also the white flag with the red cross is the flag of England, specifically, for our viewers who might not be up to date on their flags. I think you can see there Richard Tice, president of the Brexit Party, speaking to that rather large crowd there in central London. Well, our reporter Clovis Casali, who has been spending this cold January night out on the streets of London for us. Clovis, I know that you've been speaking to many people there from the Leave camp who've been celebrating despite the wintry weather.
Absolutely ecstatic, die-hard Brexit supporters here. It's a dream come true for these crowds. Quite impressive numbers here outside Westminster. On the screen just behind me, you can see several Brexit figures who've been taken to the stage to address the supporters. Several figures such as Anne Widdecombe, but also businessman Tim Martin, the owner of the famous Wetherspoons pub chain. He said that a no deal would not necessarily be a bad thing, and I can tell you that the crowds here cheered to that. There was also a film shown here, a film on the decades of EU membership for the United Kingdom. I can tell you that Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Farage, of course, got a loud applause, and then you had figures such as Tony Blair and John Major strongly booed. This is very much the night of victory for these Brexit supporters, and they've been also listening to some people taking to the stage, notably a singer called Dominic Frisby, labelled the most Brexit singer. That's how he was introduced. Well, he criticised a lot of the opponents to Brexit, a lot of the key remaining figures such as Jeremy Corbyn, and I can tell you he got also a loud applause when he was criticising those Remain figures. So this is time to celebrate for these huge crowds who see their dream come true tonight, and that is, of course, the United Kingdom leaving the European Union.
And Clovis, we've also seen Remain supporters out on the streets of London as well. Perhaps rather fewer of them, though.
Absolutely, the atmosphere completely different among the Remainers. It has to be said that with my colleagues Mohamed Farhat and Esther Martinez today on the streets of London, we did not see that many Remainers parading or marching. We expected a bit more. We did see a group of Remainers outside Westminster this afternoon, and then we saw tensions rise between the Brexiteers here and the Remainers, with Brexit supporters yelling insults at those Remainers, and police intervened, and there were no clashes there. But here outside Westminster is very much about the Brexiteers, of course. The Remainers we spoke to today, on the other hand, said that they are extremely worried for their future. One young man telling me he found it ridiculous that these celebrations were taking place, as Brexit means a time of uncertainty. According to him, he's very worried for his future, and he, like many other Remainers, believe Prime Minister Boris Johnson does not have the skills, the capabilities to take the country in the right direction in these very difficult, tough, important months coming up during the transition period, with, of course, all these trade deals and various deals to be negotiated with nations such as the United States or Australia, but also, of course, with the European Union. The European Union, which must stay a key partner, according to Remainers.
Clovis Casali, thanks so much for joining us there from Parliament Square, where that very noisy celebration is going to be continuing on for a little while. That is Brexit supporters who've been gathered there by the Brexit Party that was founded by Nigel Farage. So our next duo of guests has joined us while we was listening to Clovis Casali down in Parliament Square. We have with us Alex Storey, who was formerly head of the Eurosceptic campaign group Business for Britain and a representative of the Leave.eu business group. Hello there.
Hello.
I can see that you're dressed for a celebration.
No, that's just happenstance. I was just walking around in my black tie.
That's how you look on a Friday night.
Absolutely.
And next to you we have Nicholas Hatton. Hello there. You're the founder of the 3 million, which, to explain to our viewers, the 3 million refers to 3 million EU citizens living in the UK currently. So it's an EU citizens' rights group. You're also the founder of another new charity called We Are Settled, which is to do with helping those citizens get settled resident status.
Correct, and I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. A Frenchman in the UK for 25 years. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
OK. So, as you can tell, we have people on opposite sides of the Brexit debate with us, or perhaps differing sides, I should say. Alex Storey, as I said, you're obviously celebrating this evening. We had Clovis Casali there, though, in Parliament Square, saying that he's spoken to plenty of people in London who feel that this isn't a day for celebration. Do you have sympathy for those people?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. You know, we've been part of the EU EEC set up for nearly 50 years. I think people get used to what they know. I don't want to boast about the victory we had over successive elections, whether it's a referendum or the 2017 or the 2019 elections. The point really is now to try and bring the country together and to accept that democracies work in the way they do, and that when there's a majority of people who want something to happen, it ought to happen. But it doesn't mean to say that you ignore the people who lost. So how can this country be brought together? It's a $64,000 question, I think. Well, the first thing is, in the same way that, you know, if you lose an election, you have to accept the result of the ballot. And so if somebody is of the right and the left-wing party wins, you have to accept that the left-wing party will be able to impose policies on people who are of a conservative mindset. And in the case of Brexit, this debate has gone on for nearly as long as the First World War. People voted to leave because they didn't really buy into the setup, which was forced on them. But that doesn't mean to say that people in the UK are less likely to be, you know, friends with people in Europe. It's just it's a moving a ways, but it's also a reaffirmation of what Europe is. And Europe is a very complex set of nations, of cultures, of languages that cannot be, in the minds of Brexiters, be controlled centrally. It's quite exciting in that sense. Exciting for you, Nicholas Hatton? Is it an exciting moment?
Well, I've spoken to a lot of EU citizens over the last few weeks. I think today is quite a heavy day for most EU citizens. It's been it's been a heavy 3.5 years as a Frenchman in the UK. I felt that the atmosphere changed with the referendum towards non-British nationals, and that
the atmosphere from ordinary people, from what the government's been saying.
Well, I think it's ordinary people, and the government hasn't helped by, for example, when Theresa May called us queue jumpers. You know, that was felt very personally as an attack on a community that didn't do anything to deserve that. But you know, the UK used to be a land or a country to welcoming. I think people from were fleeing persecution, for example, and where the Huguenots who left because of the French Revolution and then contributed massively to the culture here. Charles de Gaulle and his call on the 18th of June 1940. And I think England is a very deeply European country, actually.
Well, the British government has put out since March of last year this settled status scheme where EU nationals who've already been living in this country completely legally, they make an application online. The government says it's made the process quite quick and streamlined. It's available on the internet. I'm sure they would say that they're trying to keep these EU nationals in the country.
Well, you said it's an application, and people felt quite negatively having to apply to stay in their own home. And it was promised during the campaign by Vote Leave that they would grant the status automatically. And whether that was realistic or not, that was the promise. Mm-hmm. And the application hasn't been very, very positively. The fact it's all digital is another issue that's worrying the elderly and people that don't access the internet.
Alex Story, perhaps aspects that might have been a little overlooked, or do you think these are teething problems, or...?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that Britain has always and will always be an open country, and the debate about Brexit was not about the ins and outs of how Europeans would be treated within the UK. It was about British people deciding who governs Britain.
Immigration was a big issue of the campaign, there, wasn't it?
It might or might not be. That's not why I voted Brexit, and it's not why a lot of...
But in terms of the people who were the figureheads of the campaign, Boris Johnson, as we mentioned earlier, before you were here, actually saying that, you know, Turkey was about to join the EU and all these Turkish people were going to come into the UK.
That might be the case, but don't forget that the French have been playing the Turkey card in Europe for much longer than we have. The French and the Germans have been much more sensitive about the Turkish issue than we have been in Britain for a long, long time.
I'm saying that immigration was a big part of the campaign.
It might have been, but I don't think it's the core determinant. The first and most important issue, I think, by polls showed this. It was something like 70% of people who voted Brexit wanted to know who made decisions in Britain and why decisions were made. And this is the core determinant. The fact that there are EU citizens who are friends and neighbours who don't fit the picture is something that can be, as you said, can be resolved in due course. I live in Austria, for instance. My wife is German. I grew up in France. And the one thing I would say is that people who think that Britain will be anti-French or anti-German when we leave the EU do not understand Great Britain. Great Britain is not about closing borders. It's about opening vistas to a much greater world.
All right, well, we can just bring in another report that our team's prepared, somewhat on the same topic. There have been quite a lot of British people who've actually been seeking European nationality. Many of the 14.8 million Brits who voted to remain looking for ways that they could keep their European rights. Family ties, long-term residency, or even historical links have provided routes to remaining European for tens of thousands of people. Our team's been looking into the why and the how.
2 nationalities, 2 passports, and EU rights guaranteed for life. The number of Brits applying to EU member states for citizenship has soared since 2016. Ireland has seen its citizenship applications double. In 2018 alone, 200,000 Brits with an Irish parent or grandparent used those routes to get their hands on a much sought-after European passport. What's more, anyone born in Northern Ireland is automatically eligible for dual citizenship with the Republic of Ireland. In total, 6 million Brits could become Irish if they wish to do so. Others, such as Simon Wolfish, have had to return to painful family history. Thousands of Brits have turned to a clause in Germany's constitution, which allows Jews to regain German citizenship that was stripped from their ancestors under the Third Reich.
A major family tragedy in order to shore up some security for my future and my children, my family's future. What that means in practice, I don't know. We don't want to move to Germany, but at least it means that we could, with our German passports, possibly move to Holland or France or another European country.
An estimated 1.3 million Brits living in EU countries have cause for concern about their future. Caroline and Frank Stewart arrived in France 12 years ago and recently bought a house. They have applied for French citizenship to guarantee their rights to stay in the country.
France has the right to say, right, you English need to leave. I really don't want to go back to the UK because my life is here now.
Like Caroline and Frank, around 150,000 Brits have so far applied for French nationality since the UK voted to leave the EU.
You're watching France 24's Brexit Night Special with me, Catherine Nicholson. It is coming up to 11:15 here in the British capital, 11:45 in Brussels and in Paris. We can show you live pictures right now of Downing Street, of course the heart of government, where the Prime Minister has his official residence. That is where there's going to be a countdown clock. As you can see, it's already started, being projected onto number 10 Downing Street, counting down to 11 p.m. UK time. That is the exact moment, as per the withdrawal agreement that has now been signed into EU and British law, that the United Kingdom will stop being a European Union member after 47 years of membership. There are also illuminations elsewhere in central London. We're told that the government decided that they wanted to mark the occasion but keep things relatively low key. Let's come back to our studio guests. With me here in the studio in Westminster, we have Nicholas Hatton, who is president of the 3 Million, which is an organisation that's looking out for the rights of the 3 million EU citizens living in the UK. Just looking at what's going on this evening, Alex Story telling us, of course, very European life himself. There are many people in the United Kingdom who voted leave who do say, we're not against Europeans. It's about our own country. What kind of role do you think that Europeans are going to be having in the Brexit Britain as it moves on, as Boris Johnson says that he's going to unite the country? Because, of course, that involves the European citizens living here.
Well, I think, EU citizens are here to stay. And as long as the system doesn't let them down, they will continue to build families, to work, to contribute, and to enrich the country with culture and with lots of other things. We're part of society. We've always said that this is our home, and some of us might not agree with Brexit. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we couldn't vote. We feel a bit like the children of a divorce, and we're just asking for respect and fairness.
Now, there have been suggestions by, I believe it was Keir Starmer, one of the candidates for the Labour leadership, that European citizens in the UK should have improved voting rights. Alex Story, how would you feel about that? So this talk of uniting the country and moving forward.
Well, I think that voting is a privilege, and in order to have a privilege you have to give up something in return. If you were a Frenchman and you came to live in Britain and you wanted to vote in the UK, you have to swear an oath of allegiance to the system here.
You have to take British citizenship currently.
Well, yes, but that's obvious, because you can only I can only gauge your intention if you swear that you will uphold the traditions of this country. This is a monarchy and not a republic. And so I'm very happy, and I think most Brits are very happy to have European citizens living here and we want them to stay, and everybody wants to ensure that they feel safe. A voting right is a very different thing.
So you're not totally keen for that to happen?
No, I'm not a Labour man, I'm not a communist, so I do believe that there are differences between cultures.
Well, I'm not sure Keir Starmer would describe himself as a communist, but it's very interesting to get your thoughts on that. Nicholas Hatton, do you think that EU citizens should be allowed to have these improved voting rights?
Well, there's several arguments. There's obviously the arguments no tax without representation. I've been paying tax in this country for 25 years, yet I can't vote. So, I feel this is quite wrong.
That is, of course, the situation, for example, for British citizens who live in France or other European countries.
I know, and every country is different. In Scotland, I could now vote in the Holyrood elections. In Wales, I could vote in the Welsh Assembly elections. I think the English actually a bit behind the trend.
OK, so that might be something that you would push for. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. We've got our correspondents in Brussels standing by waiting for us. But I'd like to thank you both very much, Nicholas Hatton from the 3 Million and Alex Story for joining us for this discussion. Alex, I think we'll let you go on to the party that you're heading to. But we will come back to Dave Keating, who is in Brussels for us. And Dave, it's of course a historic moment for Brussels as well, which is the de facto capital of the European Union. We know that the Brussels city mascot, the Mannequin Piss, got dressed up in a special outfit for Brexit. But apart from that, what concretely is changing in Brussels as of midnight Central European time?
Well, not much. I mean, the mood here in Brussels is pretty somber and quiet. The EU has chosen not to really mark this event in any significant way. Even the Union Jack flag outside the European Parliament came down very quietly and very suddenly. They weren't going to tell us when exactly they were going to do it. So there was just a handful of people around to catch that on video. And there's really only one public gathering. It's happening outside the European Parliament at a bar. It's relatively crowded, but people aren't in much of a partying mood. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who's very excited or happy about Brexit here in Brussels. But of course, people understand that it's a pretty major development for the EU as well as the UK. But there are a lot of pretty upset British people here as well. Earlier tonight, there was a church service actually in the non-denominational church near the European institutions where they marked the event, and I'm told it was a very emotional service actually. So it's quiet and resigned to what's happening here, I'd say.
French since 7 o'clock this morning.
Dave, in terms of the next phase of Brexit that's going to be starting as of February the 1st, of course, Boris Johnson campaigned in the general election on that slogan of "Get Brexit Done," but Brexit really won't be done until the future relationship with the European Union is in place. They've got until December 31st to do it. Can you take us through the next steps?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a Brexit in name only that happens today. What changes in just 10 minutes' time is symbolic and political. Symbolically, the UK is no longer part of the EU as of midnight our time, and they will no longer be coloured in blue on the map. More importantly, though, they will no longer have seats in the European Parliament. They'll no longer have a vote in the European Council, but they'll still be subject to all the EU rules, and they'll still get all the EU benefits. So, for instance, a British person could move to France right now without a problem during the next 11 months. It's that December 31st date that's the key here, because that's when this transition period ends. And if it's not extended, which Boris Johnson has promised he will not do, it could lead to a cliff edge, the kind of no-deal Brexit scenario that businesses have been so afraid of. So in a way, the real cliff edge countdown moment could be coming 11 months from now. We could be right back here doing another special, counting down the moment till the real Brexit begins, and that would be when the UK suddenly loses its access to the single market. And that will happen if the UK and the EU can't come to some kind of an arrangement, an agreement for a free trade association after that transition period ends.
All right, Dave, I know you'll be there with us for all of those steps as they happen there in Brussels. But thanks so much for now. We'll be speaking to you a bit later on in the evening, of course, as well. Now, we have our next guest who's just joined us in the studio while we were with Dave. I'm joined by Dennis McShane, the former UK Minister of State for Europe under Tony Blair's Labour government. Thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure.
And now, you actually predicted in 2014 that the EU referendum, if one was held, would result in a Leave win. How do you feel now that it's actually happening?
I wasn't surprised, because every referendum this century, anywhere in Europe, with the question of the EU on the voting bulletin, I'm using a phrase, bulletin de vote, the ballot paper, resulted in a no. Look at France in 2005, Constitution, Ireland in 2008 on the Lisbon Treaty, Sweden on the Euro. I could run through some others. So it was just a crazy decision of Mr. David Cameron to hold a plebiscite, which had turned almost 80 to 90% on the question of immigration. And immigration, we all know in Europe, is utterly toxic.
Well, we are now, of course, 3.5 years down the line, and I imagine you voted Remain in 2016, but the majority of people who took part in that referendum voted to leave. It is, of course, now happening. Some people are campaigning for the UK to eventually rejoin the EU. Are you among that number? Many people say that that's rather anti-democratic.
There's not a question about anti-democratic. David Davis, a prominent Brexiteer, famously said, a democracy that can't change its mind ceases to be a democracy. But
perhaps he was referring to changing its mind about European membership.
No, not at all. He was talking about other things. But his point is very, very valid. There are plenty of countries in Europe in my lifetime that have voted no to joining the European community and the European Union and then changed their mind. Anyway, for the moment, that's not the story of the day. The real question is, we spent 3.5, nearly 4 years just looking into our navel gazing.
Since the referendum, you mean?
Since the referendum, with appalling leadership from either Theresa May as Prime Minister or Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the opposition. Now that we've got a Parliament which, to be fair, Mr Johnson did not have a majority of people voting for him. The anti-Brexit parties did, but let's not get into that debate. The country's, honestly, I've never in my lifetime seen Britain so split down the middle. Where we are in London, nobody wants to leave Europe. Go to Manchester, nobody wants to leave Europe. Go to Scotland, my goodness, they're passionate about staying in Europe. Go to the areas that Mr Johnson comes from, l'Angleterre profonde, as you'd say in French. In other words, the England far away. England far away. The England's been forgotten. The England's become poor under the recent years with globalisation. They're angry. They want to blame someone. So we are where we are.
Well, we are just about 3 minutes away from that moment of Brexit. Just want to remind the viewers, we will show you that countdown live. Dennis McShane, just before we come to that, you're a Europhile. You served under a Europhile Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who made much of how much he loved Europe. He took a great part in the expansion of Europe in 2004 into the Central and Eastern former Soviet bloc states. Do you think perhaps with that expansion and the resultant changes in the European Union, did that perhaps contribute to British people's sense that the European Union wasn't for them anymore? Did he go too far?
No more than Mrs Thatcher in the 1980s expanded Europe to what then were incredibly poor countries like Spain and Italy and Greece and Portugal, and said, hey, we have to bring them in. This is good for British business. No, what contributed to it was we had a non-stop campaign for 20 years, a lot of money coming in from the United States, a lot of money coming in from offshore newspaper proprietors, and sadly the Conservative Party this century didn't want Britain to be in Europe. Well,
Britain is leaving the European Union in just a few seconds' time. Let's go to those live pictures from number 10 Downing Street, where we can see the countdown clock is ticking down to 11 p.m. UK time, midnight in Brussels. You can see just 1 minute and a few seconds left until that happens. Now, you'll remember that there had been a big crowdfunding attempt to try and get the iconic Big Ben clock tower to sound out symbolic bongs, but the government did actually agree that that wouldn't happen because of renovation works. But this is a moment, nevertheless, that millions of Brits have been waiting to celebrate, which for millions of others is a moment of
But the
sadness.
funny thing is, there's no celebration here. Look across. Can you hear the crowds? Can you sense? I bumped into Nigel Farage, my old friend. There are a few hundred people here. There are always a few hundred people for Nigel Farage. The country is at home in bed tonight. It knows the decision was taken. Now it wants to see what will happen, because tonight isn't Brexit. That is what happens in the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years.
31st of December when the transition period ends.
Even later, much later. Let's wait and see.
Let's watch those live pictures. 20 seconds, just about. Here we go. So there we go. We can see live pictures on your screen right now. You just saw Nigel Farage, the leader of the Brexit Party, before that leader of the UK Independence Party, which morphed into the Brexit Party. Of course, the leading proponent here in the United Kingdom for many, many years of the UK leaving the European Union. You saw on those big screens mounted in Parliament Square here in central London saying, "We're out," at 11 p.m. London time. That was officially, legally, the moment that the UK stopped being a member of the European Union after 47 years of membership. Let's just go back to those live pictures again of Parliament Square. With the British national anthem being sung there. You can see the lyrics being put up on the screen there for people to join in. British national anthem there being sung in Parliament Square in central London. Here in the studio I've got Dennis McShane with me, former Minister of State for Europe under a previous Tony Blair's Labour government. But we will go back right now to Clovis Casali, our reporter who has been spending the evening out there in Parliament Square, where those Brexiteers, as they call themselves, are celebrating this moment that they've been waiting for 3.5 years since that referendum, of course. Clovis Casali, can you just tell us a bit more about the atmosphere down there? How many people are still out at this Brexit moment?
I'm not sure if Clovis Casali can hear us.
I'm not sure if Clovis Casali can hear us.
I think we'll have to come back to Clovis.
I think we'll have to come back to Clovis a little bit later on. I think it's probably quite rowdy down there in Parliament Square, as we saw several hundred people, I think, at least, joining in with that Brexit Party organised celebration. Let's go instead to a different part of central London. Bénédicte Pavieux, France 24's London correspondent, who's there for us. Bénédicte, we've seen some pictures of joy, really, from those Leave voters in central London. Tell us a bit more about the atmosphere.
Well, I am just meters away, or perhaps now, after the United Kingdom leaving the EU, I should say yards away. I am reminded of the Daily Telegraph this morning. This is not an end, but a beginning. And that is certainly the message of this Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who we'll remember was an absolutely prominent leader of Brexit during the EU referendum. And interesting that the crowd sang "God Save the Queen" as we heard clearly that bongs, I think it was not actually Big Ben that is being renovated, but actually a loudspeaker playing chimes of Big Ben. This is a momentous political, constitutional, legal change. Concretely, British people, EU citizens, will be able to come and go for the next 11 months. 11 months where the divorce is now official. After 3.5 years of wrangling, we have covered every twist and turn of meaningful votes, of change of prime ministers, of historic votes, we were told, demonstrations pro, against, a people's vote, a second referendum. In the end, that snap election changed it all, changed the maths in Parliament, and Boris Johnson got his wish. Christmas come early for him. When he was a child, he wanted to be world king. Well, he hasn't achieved that yet, but he is the British Prime Minister that won an absolutely stonking majority, 80-seat majority in Parliament, rushed through at breakneck speed the WAB, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, something that Theresa May never succeeded in doing. She was fatally wounded by that snap election that she called, having said she would never do that. After 3 meaningful votes that were catastrophic for her, that she lost absolutely in huge proportions. But Boris Johnson has accomplished that. He hasn't got Brexit done. Brexit is happening. The divorce has just happened. But there is much more to go, and there will be posturing on both sides here in the United Kingdom in those negotiations and also amongst the 27. The big question, or one of the many questions, is will the 27 member states be able to stay as united as they have been in the phase 1? Because now phase 2 is going to be a very different proposition, and I think we'll hear level playing field. Everybody's going to become very familiar with that. Right, a man shouting freedom who has just come from Parliament Square. So people, Brexiteers, very, very happy with their hero, Nigel Farage, who's devoted his political ambitions and his life to getting Brexit through. And he says he will remain vigilant, but so far he's very happy and is going to be celebrating all night.
Benedict Pavio, for braving the cold. We can see quite a lot of people milling around behind you there. It is quite a lot of action here in central London.
They're leaving the Parliament
this,
Square,
Brexit
having
day.
sung their voices off.
Leaving Parliament Square, having seen Brexit phase 1 get done then. OK, well, let's come back to Dennis McShane, who's still here in the studio with us. Boris Johnson says that there's an exciting future ahead. Do you think that's possible?
I think it's a very difficult future ahead because nothing really... It's very important. I've run a couple of London marathons, and believe me, there are 1,000 times more people cheering little me on than there were just for the Nigel Farage groupies tonight. But, you know, honour to Nigel. I saw him this evening. We're old sparring partners and friends, and he's very excited. Tomorrow, he ceases to be an elected official. He ceases to have an official position. He'll just be, as it were, a civilian. And we'll see whether Brexit is actually going to happen, because Mr. Johnson now has to move from saying get it done, to actually achieving an agreement. And there, I can go into details, Benedict referred to them. It's going to be a lot more difficult. And to say to every British business, especially the Japanese firms of Airbus, you've lost all access to the European market.
Although they have been seeing Brexit coming for a few years.
Doesn't matter, because they didn't know under Theresa May what would happen. They didn't know under Boris Johnson what would happen. On Monday, today, he gave a kind of the dawn has risen, the curtain has risen. I mean, every cliche in the book. Some stage, the British government will have to spell out what it really, really means by Brexit. It hasn't done that yet. Wait and see how British businesses and foreign businesses react to what's going to be offered or proposed by Mr. Johnson.
Well, here we go. Brexit phase 2 does start right here and right now. That is, however, the moment for us to say goodbye to you. Thanks so much, Dennis McShane, for being our guest here on France 24 this evening. And we can go live now to another part of the United Kingdom that we haven't visited yet in this special programme. Belfast in Northern Ireland, France 24 senior reporter Chris Moore is there for us. Chris, Northern Irish people voted by a majority not to leave the European Union. What's the feeling there now that Brexit's actually happened?
Certainly a very different atmosphere here today, Catherine. We've spent some of today talking to representatives of the two traditional political forces in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin have been, the nationalists have been leading the Brexit mourning, as it were, and their unionist rivals, the DUP, also not particularly happy, but for reasons all of their own. We can listen now to a couple of those representatives in the Northern Irish Assembly, Sinn Féin's Deirdre Hagee and the DUP's Christopher Stolford.
It's bittersweet for me. I campaigned for Brexit and supported leaving the European Union, but unfortunately the terms of the withdrawal agreement place my part of the United Kingdom under different conditions to the rest of the United Kingdom, and I've said before I don't think it's right that Northern Ireland should have been placed in this position. I always had one view on Brexit, which was we went in as one United Kingdom and we should leave as one United Kingdom.
I think it's a sad day for the people here in the north because there is a real genuine feeling that we're being taken out of the European Union against our will. And whilst it may be a good day for some of those in England and across Britain, and we wish them well, it is a sad day for the people here, but also a concern as to what negotiations lie ahead and ensuring that the Irish protocol is retained throughout.
We heard it there, Sinn Féin not happy about Brexit, the DUP not happy about the terms and conditions of Brexit after Boris Johnson's deal. Northern Ireland is a place where the politics and divisions of the past are still very much part of the present, but I think there is another sentiment which cuts across a bit of that, namely that Brexit was something which in a way came from afar, and some of the thorniest issues, some of the most difficult things to resolve about it, most notably border and trade issues here in Northern Ireland, have really overshadowed what's been going on here for the last 3 years or so, and a lot of people are still a little bit doubtful going forward as to what Boris Johnson's deal is actually going to entail for them, not least Northern Irish businesses.
Chris Moore reporting there from Belfast for us. Thank you so much. I hope to speak to you again a bit later on in our special programme. Just a reminder for our viewers, it's just about 11 here in London. 10 minutes into the UK no longer being a member of the European Union. Now, of course, the UK made up of several nations which all voted somewhat differently in the EU referendum in 2016. Scotland was the most Remain-leaning part of the United Kingdom. Earlier on Friday, Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, spoke about what she would like the future to hold.
And here in Scotland, given that it is happening against the will of the vast majority of us, that sadness will be tinged with anger. Now, it would be very easy to dwell on that, on all that is being taken away from us. But that's not what I want to do today. Instead, I want to focus on something much, much more important. Hope. Hope of a different and better future for Scotland. Make no mistake, after tonight, that future is only open to us with independence.
Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon speaking there a little bit earlier on, just a few hours ago. We can cross to Edinburgh, the Scottish capital. Our senior reporter Catherine Norris-Trent is there for us. And Catherine, you've been telling us about how many people you've been speaking to, for them it's quite a sad day.
Yeah, a very sad day for a lot of people here in the crowd outside the Scottish Parliament. People have come down here for an anti-Brexit protest, and there's also a lot of people here really supporting the idea of Scottish independence. People telling me they just feel they haven't been listened to. And there was quite a poignant moment just a few moments ago as 11 p.m. here in the UK time, Britain left the EU, Scotland left the EU, and people here burst into song. There are bagpipes playing and quite a few tears among the crowd. And I'm joined by some of the people who are in the crowd. Andrew Taylor, an 18-year-old student from Glasgow. How are you feeling, Andrew, at this moment now?
The whole thing's just sort of raw at the moment. It's been quite a tough day for me, and I've just felt sort of low. It feels like you are losing a big part of yourself. I am European, I will always be European, and I just feel like it's just been taken from me. I've had no say in that, and it's just been taken.
And you're telling me earlier you're 18 years old, obviously you couldn't even vote in the Brexit referendum. I mean, how does that make you feel?
It annoys me that it's me and that my generation will be affected by this, and we will grow up with this, and it's not even us that have voted for it. The ones who will be worst affected by this will be the ones who have to endure it for the longest and got no say in it whatsoever.
And do you support Scottish independence now going forward?
I do support Scottish independence. I think all you need to do is look at what's happening in the square here at the Scottish Parliament compared to Parliament Square down in England and see the two parliaments are completely different. We're no longer compatible. It's not about hate, it's not about anything. It's just we no longer work together as a union. It's not a union of equals, and it can't keep doing this.
All right, thank you very much indeed for your time, Andrew, tonight. I'm also joined here by Moray and her 15-year-old son, Dylan. Thanks very much. Moray, how are you feeling tonight, post-Brexit?
Gutted, disbelief. I just can't believe it's actually happened, because to me it feels like the lies and the untruths that were told during the campaign have won, and it feels like democracy died a little bit. So yeah, I'm gutted.
And Dylan, you're 15. Obviously, a lot of young people have been telling me they're disappointed by today. How are you feeling, though?
A bit betrayed, almost, because a lot of the benefits that a lot of adults received, they didn't even understand why, and they still voted to take that away from me and my entire generation, and we're going to suffer the brunt of it because of how they voted.
And do you think it will impact your future?
A lot, yeah. I was planning on using Erasmus when I'm at university, and obviously I can't do that because the UK Parliament just voted for that not to happen. I really wanted to think about living somewhere like the Netherlands, and I was even learning Dutch to do that, and that's at risk now.
And Moray, when you listen to your son saying that, I mean, it must be really difficult.
It is, because I did do an Erasmus year in France. It really opened my worldview. It made me feel so much more international, more connected. I think if you live and you experience another culture, you grow and develop so much more as a human being, and it just feels like part of a fundamental narrowing, and it makes everything less. So I'm really sad that they're not going to have the same opportunities. It just feels like Britain is moving in on itself in an unhealthy way, and Scotland's being forced to do that as well.
Now, Boris Johnson says you've got to be optimistic, we've got to unite now, it's a new dawn. Does that not stir anything in you coming together after Brexit?
No, it doesn't. Obviously, I hope things aren't a disaster because, we want the least harm possible to happen. But I think democracy, a lot of it is about how you treat the minorities. And they're basically saying, come together, we've won, put up with it. They're not saying, well, OK, how can we listen to the 48%? There was only a mandate for a soft Brexit. There wasn't a mandate for what is happening just now. So I think it's wishful thinking on Boris Johnson's part.
All right, we'll have to leave there, I'm afraid. Thanks to Dylan, Moray and Andrew there, and echoing many of the voices we've heard tonight here in Edinburgh.
All right, Catherine Norris-Trent, thank you so much for bringing us those interviews with those people who, as you said, have come out to express their sadness and disappointment about the UK leaving the European Union. Of course, there were people in Scotland who voted to leave as well. We will talk about the situation in Scotland in just a moment. But our latest duo of studio guests has now joined us while we were listening to Catherine Norris-Trent. We are joined by Catherine Barnard. Hello there.
Hello there.
Professor of European Union Law and Labour Law at Cambridge University, the esteemed Cambridge University. And next to you, we have Andrew Bell. Hi there.
Hi.
Now, you stood as a Brexit Party candidate in the recent general election in December in John Bercow's constituency.
His former constituency.
Yes. The former Speaker of the House of Commons. Andrew Bell, obviously, I imagine you are celebrating tonight. You're wearing a tie in Brexit Party colours, which I imagine is not a coincidence.
So? Yeah, it's just a nice tie.
Now, I don't want to spoil your moment of celebration, but the hard work really does start now for the UK government, doesn't it?
I'm not sure that it does. I think the hard work was what came up to now. As you can see, it was because most of that time they didn't have a proper working majority, which of course made it much harder. As soon as Boris Johnson came in, he made a difference, and as soon as he got his majority, that made a huge difference, and so everything has been finished. But from now on, remember that we're just talking about something quite simple, about whether we have a free trade agreement or not. And we are going to want to diverge, and we're going to be very clear about parts of that. For example, I don't think we can accept the precautionary principle in the extended form in which the EU has now adopted it.
Well, just to explain to our viewers who perhaps are not following things quite as closely as us, we're talking about de-aligning from European Union rules, yes. Which the United Kingdom up to now has had to uphold. Things that many businesses have complained have made their lives more difficult, more expensive. You believe that Boris Johnson will be able to get a free trade agreement while de-aligning from the European Union? That's something that Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, has been very strongly saying she doesn't want to see happen. Is it possible?
I mean, there's no point at all in leaving unless we're going to de-align, and we are going to de-align. And we are also going to do some things like holding on to our fisheries.
In that case, would you accept that there would be more friction in the trading relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom?
And I think that has been accepted, although the sensible thing, of course, to do would be for the EU to make trade in goods very easy and, in fact, free, because they have a surplus in that.
Well, let's speak to Catherine Barnard. Hello there.
Hi there.
Of course, an expert in the European Union, of course. Talking about de-aligning on certain issues, including goods. But for the European Union, it says that the four freedoms, the freedom of movement of people as well as goods, of capital, all around the European Union, they are indivisible. Do you believe that it is possible that the European Union could show a little flexibility in order to keep a relationship with this very strong, very wealthy economy that is the United Kingdom?
That's right. I think it's interesting. The EU's always been consistent. The four freedoms are indivisible, and yet now there is some signs of the EU itself wanting to cherry-pick that if there's going to be free movement of goods, there's got to be a level playing field to go with it. Now, a level playing field is EU jargon for the UK will have to sign up to EU rules on state aids, so that states can't give businesses money without very strict criteria.
Because the EU sees that as an unfair advantage.
Absolutely. Consumer, environmental and social matters. Now, Boris Johnson so far has said, no, we're not going to accept it. If we're going to have a really serious de-alignment Brexit, we should not be signing up to level playing field provisions. The problem is some practical points. One, that the EU is our biggest trading partner, and so UK producers will still have to manufacture their goods in accordance with EU standards if they want to sell them on the EU market. Now, there's nothing to stop the UK from de-aligning if we are in a free trade agreement, but the fact is for manufacturers who are selling into the EU market, they will have to comply with EU rules in the same way that Chinese manufacturers or US manufacturers do. Now, Boris Johnson will say, well, we might want to de-align, but we don't want to do it straight away. But from the EU's point of view, they say, too bad, the friction comes in straight away because it's the possibility of de-alignment that will cause that friction in trade.
And, of course, when we're looking at the next phase of Brexit, which begins now, the negotiations on that future relationship, and it's not just about trade, it's also about all sorts of other matters, security, research.
Services, transport, energy,
all sorts
fish.
Of things, satellites, fish, exactly. Yeah. There are 27 member states, Andrew Bell, who have up to now shown remarkable solidarity.
Yes, but that was in the easy part. It will be much more difficult for them to show solidarity in this part. For example, the Germans would like to continue selling cars to us. We're not only a big market, but it's extremely profitable, one of the most profitable markets. And there are other similar situations. But I do think there is going to be some divergence, and I'm sure you'd agree. It's not just a question of whether we align now at the beginning, but the question of dynamic alignment, of continuing to follow EU rules as they change, that would essentially mean that we were letting them be our lawmakers when we didn't have any participation in the decisions. That's clearly untenable for a whole host of reasons, and therefore there is going to be change there. And this is the thing that will have to be negotiated. But I don't think it's hugely complicated. I think, there'll have to be a decision in principle.
Michel Barnier thinks it's complicated.
Well, I think that's because he thinks it's going to be just like the last negotiation. But you've always heard about generals fighting the last war. This is going to be different. It's a question of, do you accept the principle, yes or no?
How much do you think can be agreed, though, by... It's not really the 31st of December, is it? It's sort of October time, I think, that everything really has to be sewn up.
Yes.
One of the quickest free trade agreements that the EU has signed, I think Catherine Barnard can give me the detail on this, was with Canada, and that took around about 7 years. The UK trying to achieve in 8-10 months what Canada took 7 years to do? Is that possible?
Only 7% of our businesses export at all, and there's no reason why they should all be governed by EU regulation. When we buy things from Japan, when we buy things from America, we're buying from countries with which we have no trade agreements at all. Most of the world works without trade agreements. The Australians can't understand what the fuss is about because they don't have trade agreements with most people.
But such a huge amount of trade goes between the UK and the European Union, doesn't it?
It's going down all the time.
It is the dominant trade relationship.
And it's also the slowest growing part of the world. I mean, I'm flying tomorrow to 3 African countries where we're doing business. Africa is really beginning to develop. Asia, of course, is growing still fast. And South America is growing fast. And even the US has an inherently higher growth rate than the EU.
Well, to get a bit of an insight from Brussels, we can go back to our correspondent there, Dave Keating, who is going to be the person who is following most closely, probably, for France 24, that process that we've just been speaking about, those future relationship negotiations. Dave, have you got a sense that Michel Barnier, that those negotiating teams and the member states are ready to act as one in this next phase of negotiations? Or, as our guests have been suggesting, do you think that there are already signs of tensions?
Well, what's interesting is in the Brexit negotiations up till now, the EU27 has shown remarkable unity. Really, it surprised a lot of people how unified they were, but there are some signs of cracks in that unity, possibly. In December at the European Council Summit, the EU leaders signed off on conclusions that said they wanted to start negotiations on that future trading relationship immediately after Brexit Day. So assumedly, in that case, they should be starting Monday, February 3rd. But we heard this week that actually now the Council is saying that they cannot start those negotiations until the 3rd of March at the earliest. Why? We're hearing that there are maybe some disagreements, maybe some complications about setting the EU's negotiating mandate. We don't have a really clear idea yet whether that's just inevitable complications because setting a negotiating mandate is something that takes time, or if it's the result of some disagreements between the member states. What we do know, though, is that this is already proving to be a very complicated process because that 1 month delay in the start of negotiations means that so they had 11 months until the end of the transition period, but as your guest noted earlier, we're really talking about 8 months because you need time to ratify the agreement, and any kind of delay to that makes it even shorter. So now we're looking at 7 months to conduct a complete free trade agreement. It seems very unlikely to people here. So we're not sure if this delay means that there is some kind of internal disagreement there.
All right, we'll have to wait and see, of course. Thanks so much, Dave Keating, our correspondent there in Brussels. We've just got a couple of minutes left before we have to let our guests here in the studio move on. But I wanted to talk to you about the United Kingdom, about constitutional matters. It's not just about trade with the European Union. We've heard a little bit earlier on this half hour about how all those people who Catherine Norris-Trent was speaking to in Scotland, very unhappy that the UK is leaving the EU. We had Nicola Sturgeon saying that she wants to really relaunch the Scottish independence movement now. Catherine Barnard, do you believe that it could be easy for Scotland to rejoin the EU as an independent nation?
It will be relatively easy for them to rejoin the EU, particularly if they say that they're happy to have the euro and they are happy to join Schengen. And of course, at the moment, they are fully aligned. The far bigger question is whether the EU will really want Scotland, because, of course, it will then give the green light to other independence movements to further their own cause, particularly in Catalonia in Spain. But there's a really big question for Scotland, which is, do they really want to leave the United Kingdom internal market? Because, of course, for Scotland, the biggest trading partner is England. And if they're going to create barriers north-south between Scotland and England, that will be a very serious issue for Scottish trade. And we've seen all the problems with Northern Ireland and how there was a very delicate protocol was negotiated to avoid a hard border between the north and south of Ireland. And the EU went a long way to avoid that hard border because they know of the very difficult circumstances in Northern Ireland during the period of the Troubles, which eventually were more or less resolved through the Good Friday Agreement. It's the risk of a border on the island of the United Kingdom is really quite serious. But nevertheless, Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon is determined to have a second referendum.
She is indeed determined, and of course we ought to say to our viewers that the British government, the central British government, does have to approve any Scottish independence referendum, and currently Boris Johnson is firmly not giving that any truck at all. Andrew Bell, as we said, you stood for the Brexit Party in the general election. When the whole Brexit process was starting, the campaign, did you think that it could lead to quite serious talk about the UK breaking up, and do you think that it's a serious possibility now?
Well, actually, I would agree with every word that Catherine said. The only addition that I would make is to point out again that there was a referendum on Scotland leaving, which we gave them, and it was an agreement that it would be a once-in-a-generation referendum, and 55% of people wanted to remain with the UK. That was when they thought that oil was going to be a very valuable resource and get them much more revenues. The economic problems of Scotland, the fact that they have so much subsidy from Britain, has become more pronounced now, and I think probably more Scots would find it difficult to contemplate leaving Britain. So
do you think there should be a referendum to find out?
No, I don't think there can be another referendum.
Why not?
Otherwise, it's just a matter of carrying on having them until they give the answer you want.
I think Nicola Sturgeon has argued that things have fundamentally changed.
Well, no, but I mean,
in terms of, well, when Scotland had its independence referendum in 2014, it would have been leaving the EU if it had left the United Kingdom.
There had already been a commitment by that time to hold a referendum.
On the EU membership. Yeah. Yes, but the UK had not voted to leave the EU. Well, do you think that things have changed enough for a referendum?
The EU always likes to make people vote again until they get the right answer. They couldn't do that with Britain. And I think Nicola Sturgeon wants the same thing. But no, it's quite wrong. There was a clear understanding that that was going to be the referendum. The basic arguments on whether Scotland should be with the UK or not have not changed as a result of all of this. As Catherine said, it's by far the biggest market for them, and it would be extraordinarily difficult to disentangle Scotland and England after hundreds of years of shared destiny.
Catherine Barnard, Nicola Sturgeon has been lobbying very hard throughout these last 3.5 years in the European Union with her independence message. Do you believe that she has sympathetic ears in Europe?
She has some, of course, because, of course, the EU understands that the majority in Scotland voted to remain, and they feel that being forced to leave with the United Kingdom as a whole is not just. But they also recognise that there are serious, broader European-wide issues if they allow Scotland back in, particularly over giving succour to separatist movements elsewhere in the EU. I think what we would say is, of course, the whole raison d'etre of Nicola Sturgeon and her party is an independent Scotland. And the one thing that we do need to watch out for is that there are 55 SNP seats in the Westminster
Scottish National Party.
Scottish National Party. And, of course, they are overwhelmingly the dominant force north of the border. And so they will be using that force to lobby in Westminster. But of course, at the moment, the Conservatives have such a large majority that they can block any attempt at having a referendum. But the trouble is it will build up a sense of grievance. And that's what Nicola Sturgeon is playing on, a grievance that the Scots are not being listened to.
I'd like to talk about another part of the United Kingdom in just a second, but just a reminder for our viewers who might have joined us in the last couple of minutes. It is now 11:30 here in London. 30 minutes ago, the United Kingdom formally and legally stopped being part of the European Union. You are watching France 24's Brexit Night special with me, Catherine Nicholson. So you've got live pictures on your screen right now of number 10 Downing Street. Of course, the historic residence of the UK Prime Ministers since the 18th century. The British government arranging some light displays to go on rather late into the evening as it celebrates that moment that was voted for in the referendum in 2016. I'd just like to come back to our two guests in the studio. We've been talking quite a lot about Scotland. Of course, there's the issue of Northern Ireland. We spoke to Chris Moore in Belfast a little earlier on. We know that the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was a very, very difficult one to resolve during the withdrawal agreement negotiations. We have heard from Chris and from some of his guests that there are people there worried that there could be a resurgence of violence on the island of Ireland now that Brexit is happening, and Northern Ireland will have a slightly different status from the rest of the United Kingdom under the withdrawal agreement that Boris Johnson has drawn up. Andrew Bell, are you concerned about that?
No, I don't think there's any real likelihood of a resurgence of violence. What I do think is the case is that there is there's been a slight dynamic in favour of those who want to unite Ireland, because ultimately the Anglo-Irish Agreement says that if there's a majority in the north for unification, it will happen. And if anything, that tilt has just very, very slightly increased.
Catherine Barnard, what's your sense? The Republic of Ireland, a very different country now from what it was even in 20 years ago. Its economy has changed so drastically. It's, on the most recent polling, very staunchly pro-European nation. A majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain. How realistic do you think the prospect of a united Ireland is, however?
I don't think it's imminent, but I think it was very telling that Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, thought that there would be a united Ireland in his lifetime. Now, he's a young man, and so, you know, there's probably another 60 years, but the fact is that he's talking about it is really quite striking. In the past, that really would have been quite an incendiary thing to say, but the fact is that a serious politician is talking about suggests that there are movements, there are currents that suggest it. But remember, the Republic, the South, is actually more liberal than the North, because it has relaxed its laws on abortion and so forth, and gay marriage. This is now also changing in Northern Ireland. But Northern Ireland is highly dependent on public sector money and public investment. And the question is whether Ireland would be prepared to take on that really significant financial commitment to helping support the North, because the principal employer in the North is the public sector. And this is really significant because what the North does not have is a lot of small businesses, a lot of entrepreneurial activity, and that's what makes the North quite a responsibility if the South takes it on.
Yeah, there's a slight demographic change, but also the disincentives for the North getting together with the South in the past were, first of all, the dominant role of the Catholic Church, and secondly, the fact that the South was poorer.
The Republic
GNP, yes, the South, the Republic. The Republic has actually got now a higher GDP per head than the United Kingdom, which will come as a surprise to a lot of people. So I completely concur with what Catherine says. It could happen faster than we think.
OK, perhaps not quite as close as Nicola Sturgeon believes that Scottish independence and rejoining the EU could be. Thank you both so much for talking through all of those matters with us. Andrew Bell, Brexit Party member, and Catherine Barnard, Professor of European Law at Cambridge University.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, well, it's just gone 11:30 in London, as we said. Let's go back live to Clovis Casali, our reporter who spent the entire day out on the streets of London for us. Clovis, we saw a big party going on in Parliament Square with you at the moment of Brexit. Are people still partying there?
Indeed, you still have a few hundred Brexiteers, die-hard Brexit supporters, gathering here at Parliament Square outside Westminster, where this big party is happening. Those who are still here are sipping champagne. Crowds were much larger earlier on in the build-up to this big moment, this historic moment when the country officially left the European Union. I saw some people here in tears. Their dream came true minutes ago. They came from all over the country to be here in London, in the heart of the power of the country outside Westminster, for this moment, for this event, for this Leave Means Leave party, as they labelled it. And you had several Brexit figures come up on stage behind me and address these Brexit supporters. And of course there was Nigel Farage, their favourite, the man who, according to them, made Brexit happen. That's how he was introduced anyway. Nigel Farage had very strong words saying, "The war is over, we have won." Not quite words that can heal the wounds in a very divided nation. Nigel Farage also saying that this was a victory against the establishment. We achieved something truly remarkable. And what might have been a bit more surprising was when Nigel Farage said that Boris Johnson was acting the same way. Boris Johnson is saying all the right things. Those were the words of the Brexit Party leader. So here, clearly, Catherine, a lot of very happy, ecstatic Brexit supporters from all over the country who gathered here, waving the Union Jack, singing national anthems such as Rule Britannia or the Land of Hopes and Glory, and a very important moment for them, a historic moment, of course, for the nation.
A very historic moment. Thanks so much, Clovis Ghazali, for being there for us in Parliament Square in central London, where, as we said, Brexit-supporting members of the public have gathered to mark the UK leaving the European Union. That process has been rather drawn out. It's gone on for a little bit longer than the British government had intended. There were 2 extensions to the Brexit process. That added up to a lot of uncertainty for many people, including the 73 British members of the European Parliament. It's been a very emotional week for them. France 24's Brussels correspondents Alix Le Bourdon and David Keating went to meet 2 to find out what they intend to do next.
Just a few hours left in this office that she's worked in for almost 8 years.
OK, the packing starts.
This Northern Irish MEP is turning the page on Europe, but she's doing so with great emotion. She's fought all her life for the ideas of her party, Sinn Féin.
Oh, there you are. There you are. Look at there. I am there. Yeah.
Part of the UK, Northern Ireland was at the centre of the Brexit negotiations, with the threat of a return to a physical border on the island of Ireland. This former member of the IRA does not hide her anger at her forced departure on the 31st of January. In 2016, her region voted over 56% to stay in the EU.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking primarily about the people who sent me here. They, like me, know that we are being kicked out against their democratically expressed wishes to remain in the EU.
But there's no defeatism for this convinced activist. She's taking advantage of these last moments in Brussels to make contacts.
How are you? How are you? How are you?
Wanted by Spain for sedition, these 2 Catalan separatists have just been authorized to take up their duties as MEPs.
There are interests that we share with them, such as the right to self-determination, so they know they can count on us.
When I am away, I need them to be continuing to articulate the need of the people in Ireland's right for a unity referendum.
For this other member of Parliament, Molly Scott-Cato, saying goodbye is also difficult. These Oxford students are visiting her at the European Parliament.
Yeah, it was a very nice feeling to be able to feel useful. And I'd love to carry on doing that.
It's a unique atmosphere for these British students to find themselves in.
It's already weird when we get our British passports out and it's like, and they check them and it's like, oh, this is going to be different in like a year. Completely different.
Smile.
Scott-Cato is trying to forget that these are her last moments in Brussels. But she can't help but feel a little bitterness.
I see all these exciting policy changes like the European Green Deal, and I just can't be a part of it. So yeah, it's sad and frustrating.
From the 1st of February, this flag is no longer going to fly outside the European Parliament here in Brussels. The UK will become a foreign country to the EU, and it will have to decide what that future relationship is going to look like.
Dave Keating reporting there for us from Brussels on the departure of the UK's 73 members of the European Parliament. And you might be interested to know that some of those seats have been redistributed to other EU member states. In fact, France has picked up 5 new MEP seats, which has actually changed the political balance somewhat in France. But I think we'll talk about that another day. It is a good moment, though, to bring in a Frenchman into our studio, Michel de Fabiani. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good evening.
You're the director of the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. Now, you yourself live in Paris, but you have a satellite office here in London. So on this Brexit evening, how do you feel? Is this a moment for celebration, for commiseration, or just a moment to sort of get on with it?
Well, it's a historic moment, that's obvious. A historic minute, I would say, at 23. This being said, life continues and business needs to continue. Mm-hmm. And I think the importance is the next step, which is the transition period and all the deals and the negotiation which starts 25th of February and has to be finished by the end of 2020.
It's ambitious, isn't it? Let's listen to what Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, had to say a little bit earlier on in his address to the nation about that future relationship and the deal that he's hoping to strike with the EU.
We want this to be the beginning of a new era of friendly cooperation between the EU and an energetic Britain, a Britain that is simultaneously a great European power and truly global in our range and ambitions.
Boris Johnson saying he wants a new era of friendly cooperation between the UK and the European Union. Now, in terms of the businesses that you liaise with, you work with, Michel Fabiani, are they looking forward to friendly cooperation, or are they concerned about what might come next?
The cooperation exists already, so it's continuing and probably reinforcing, because there will be new dimensions which the UK will look at, like India or other countries or China or whatever. The EU will do the same on its own, so it will be even more important to ensure the coordination of these actions through trade deals, business deals, and the reality is that the European groups becoming more international, they will need to continue to have a foot in the UK and a foot on the continent.
Well, of course, France and the UK have a very established economic relationship, if only because of geographical proximity. There's a lot of trade goes across the Dover-Calais crossing, and I think around 5% of the UK's electricity is actually generated in France currently. So the ties are deep and they're strong. Are French businesses getting to have a say in what might come next, either with the French government or with the British government? Are your voices being heard?
Well, I think there are very important sectors. You mentioned electricity, nuclear energy, automobile, aircraft, tourism, banks, insurance, utilities. I mean, the list is very long, fashion, etc. So obviously, in both sides, there will be a need that the governments listen to what their business tell them. So it's already the case. If Boris Johnson talks about a cooperation, it's not by coincidence. And President Macron has always said that UK and France need to be even more coordinated in future than they were before, because they are the two, after Germany, the two biggest countries in Europe anyway, and this will remain. Europe will remain, the EU will be different for UK or not UK, but as was said by the Prime Minister Johnson, it remains in Europe.
Now, of course, we've been talking with our other guests this evening about the fact that Boris Johnson is going to be looking for a free trade agreement with the European Union. He wants to have zero tariffs, zero quotas for British businesses dealing with the EU. But he also wants to change the regulatory alignment, as the jargon goes, not adhere to some of the same laws as European businesses. Ursula von der Leyen, the current European Commission President, she's really spoken out a lot about this. She's trying to tell Boris Johnson that's not going to be on the table. Is that something that you would be concerned about, the UK being unfair competition on Europe's doorstep?
Yeah, I would distinguish the norms, the obligations. If you take pharmaceuticals or food, there are norms, and this will be professional norms. And it would be strange that the profession in the UK would take different norms than the profession in France, in Germany, or in Europe.
But this is what Boris Johnson's saying he's going to do.
I don't think it's about norms, and it's more about probably the ability to deal with other countries in a different level or a different way than the EU will. Now, what was raised in Brussels by the Commission is it should not be a dumping situation. But there will be differences, obviously.
So are the French businesses that you work with, are they adjusting? Before the referendum, there were a lot of warnings from the Remain campaign that if Britain voted to leave the European Union, then European businesses who were based here would just pack up and leave.
I think we should make a difference between what is existing, and there may be some relocation, but they are very minor on both sides. In fact, there are more relocation from London to Paris than the reverse at the moment. But the important point is for the future. Future investments will be the key. So there will be a transition period. People will look at what is the outcome of it. And according to what happens, if it's free trade, not so free trade, dumping, whatever, then they will have to decide where do they take the new investment, the next investment. So for me, it's more a medium-term issue than a very short-term issue. In the short term, things will continue. The question is, will we want to invest in the UK or in another EU country? And will UK want to invest in EU or in a non-EU area? But that's for, I would call, medium term.
All right, Michelle de Fabiani, we'll have to just turn for the moment to our reporters who are out on the ground all around the United Kingdom. They've been reporting all evening for us. I think we're going to go first to Belfast, to Chris Moore. Chris, if you can just sort of sum up the mood of the day there in Belfast as you've been talking to people all throughout what's been known as Brexit Day.
Well, it kind of depends where you stand on the Brexit issue. Obviously, politically, there's two pretty trenchant reactions coming out from the two big players in Northern Irish politics. Sinn Féin, for them, it's been what they said, a sad day for Northern Ireland, leading the Brexit morning, as it were. Their rivals, the unionist DUP, many of whom campaigned for Brexit, but they're not happy about Boris Johnson's terms and conditions, the way the new border arrangements are going to operate, the fact that there may be some EU rules are still in operation here in Northern Ireland. That's a level of differentiation between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK that many of them simply can't stomach. Those are the most trenchant views. There's obviously a whole spectrum here, and I think one attitude, one sentiment which to an extent cuts across those traditional divides, really that Northern Ireland had all of this opposed on it by a vote which originated elsewhere, and it's been left really to bear the brunt of some of the thorniest issues surrounding Brexit, not least over borders and trade, and at the same time hasn't had much of a say either in what's happened up to now, and the fear is in what's going forward. Politicians at Stormont and business representatives here in Northern Ireland will be hoping to change that.
OK, Chris Moore reporting there for us from Belfast. Thanks so much. Let's turn now, as we count down to almost 1 a.m. in Paris and the end of our programme, to Bénédicte Pavillot, our London correspondent, who also has spent the day in the British capital. Bénédicte, England was a leave voting country, but London is a remain voting city. Where do you think London goes from here?
Well, London is the heart, political heart of the United Kingdom, but it's a very disunited kingdom still. And the hope of the Prime Minister is really for Remainers and Leavers no longer to have those labels. Certainly, I understand that the civil servants will be discouraged from using the word Brexit anymore. And certainly as somebody who's half French, half British, who lives in this capital, who lives in this country, born in Paris but living here, a day of mixed emotions for many people, and a day certainly I thought I would never see. But it is here, and it's we've covered every twist and turn, and of course we will cover every twist and turn of the coming 11 months. Franco-British relations will continue because they are excellent in terms of defence, in terms of security, in terms of the two peoples being interested in each other and having cultural, social, economic and all kinds of ties. One man who's got a new job is called João Vale de Almeida. He has just tweeted he is the new EU ambassador to the United Kingdom. Yes, the United Kingdom on Friday the 31st of January at 11 p.m. didn't just leave the European Union after nearly half a century. It actually acquired an EU ambassador. And la suite continue, as we say in French, the rest continues, and we will see what is in store in the next 11 months. The countdown has begun to the 31st of December 2020.
All right, thanks so much, Bénédicte Pavillot, our London correspondent, joining us for the last time of this very special programme here on France 24. Thanks as well to Michel de Fabiani, our studio guest for this last part of the programme, Director of the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much for coming in and giving us your insights. I'm sure we'll come back to you as this negotiation process continues and we find out more about what it means for French and other European businesses in the UK. Well, it is almost midnight here in Paris and time for us to wrap up our programme. So thanks to you as well for watching. And as we said, we've had our reporters braving the elements all evening for us in Belfast, Edinburgh, Brussels and London. We've also had our production team on both sides of the channel. As Boris Johnson's hero, Winston Churchill, said, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Here on France 24, we will be following this Brexit story wherever it takes us next. For now, good night from London. We will leave you with this look back on the Brexit saga so far, put together by our producer in Paris, Yi Song.